Hello and welcome back to The Note, where we'll be continuing to talk to Eswar Prasad about this fascinating book, The Dollar Trap. As we've already discussed, the dollar continues to be the reserve currency almost by default. Even if crises are happening in the US itself, the US still has a monopoly of perceived safety. That leads to another very important question, which is the direction in which capital flows. Why does capital tend to flow from poor countries to rich when it really ought to be the other way around? With me now to discuss this once more is Professor of Economics at Cornell University, Eswar Prasad. Eswar, thanks for joining me once more. Let's take a look first of all at the total amount of debt held by the US. It's a quite terrifyingly large number and increasing very fast, largely financed by people outside the US. How can this be happening?
This should make people very worried. The amount of gross federal debt in the US is roughly equivalent to annual GDP.
Right.
And if you look at the privately held federal debt, that is debt held by foreign and domestic investors, nearly 60% of that is held by foreign investors. But the reality again is that given the turmoil created by the US itself and the problems in the other advanced economies and emerging markets, everybody feels the need for safety, especially emerging markets that want to buy more and more foreign exchange reserves. And they need safe and liquid assets to put those in. And the US has the biggest, baddest market of them in some sense. It's got a huge, very liquid government bond market, and that's what people come to, maybe not so much for safety, but really for liquidity.
Okay, now let's take a look at the importance. Everybody's talked very much about the importance of China. It became a big political issue in the US at one point, with nightmare scenarios that China might decide to sell all its debt and crash the US economy in the process. It's not just about China, though. If anything, it seems that the rest of the emerging markets are accelerating their accumulation of US reserves. What's going on there?
That's right. Emerging markets as a group now hold about $8 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves, almost all of that accumulated since the end of the Asian financial crisis. About half of that is China, the other half is other emerging markets. Why is this? Because emerging markets have much more open capital accounts, which means capital can flow in and out more easily. They're more subject to capital flow volatility and also more currency volatility. And they're very concerned about the policies of the Fed and other advanced economy central banks. So they want to protect themselves. And how do you do that? By accumulating foreign exchange reserves. And that's what they've been doing.
I mean, is there any sense in which they've overlearned the lessons of the Asia crisis? I mean, do they really need to keep accumulating reserves at this kind of a level?
Perhaps China doesn't need that much more for safety, although China does have a lot of fragilities in its financial system. But for the other emerging markets, it's a real concern. If you take a country like India, for instance, India now has about $300 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves. It sounds like a lot, but when the crisis hit, many emerging markets lost nearly a quarter of their reserves in a period of just 7 to 8 months. And those numbers are very scary.
Right.
So emerging markets seem to have this view right now that you can never have too much.
So we'll therefore continue to see more purchases of attractive reserve currencies. Now, let's finally take a look. There are other currencies out there that could conceivably rival the dollar. None of them seems to have made much traction. You do see some slight decline, though, in the dollar as a reserve currency. Are there any other plausible candidates out there in the developed world at the moment? And also, what would it take for the renminbi to take over as a reserve currency?
The euro did seem to be getting some traction early in the early years after the inception of the euro, but its flatline and the eurozone debt crisis certainly didn't help the euro. The interesting thing is that the dollar share has stabilized even after the financial crisis. The euro could become a viable contender to the dollar if there was true economic union, which means not just monetary union, but banking union and fiscal union. They're trying to make some steps, but I think it's going to be a long haul.
Yes.
The renminbi is an intriguing contender, but I suspect that the renminbi, once it becomes a convertible currency, could become a reserve currency. If they have better financial markets so foreign investors can get renminbi assets, it could become a viable reserve currency. Will it challenge the dollar? No. And I think the answer to that question comes from my sense that institutions are really important, and China doesn't have the political, legal and other public institutions that can match the US. So I don't think that the renminbi might erode, but it's in no way going to challenge the dollar's supremacy.
Okay, so you can see it becoming what you might call a secondary reserve currency along the lines of where the euro has reached now. You don't see any chance of the renminbi, so assuming we don't see political and legal reforms in China, you don't see any chance of the renminbi actually supplanting the dollar as the linchpin of the system?
It's highly unlikely. People will go to China for diversification, for higher returns, and to some extent to put some of their money for safety. But is it going to be really seen as a safe haven? I think it's highly unlikely. So I can see the renminbi, if they continue with the economic and financial market reforms, accounting for maybe 5 to 10% of global foreign exchange reserves in the next decade or two, but that's not going to challenge the dollar in any significant way.
Okay, Eswar, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure. The bottom line is clear. We are stuck with the dollar as a reserve currency. That doesn't mean that it can't necessarily continue gently to lose some of its value, its exchange rate compared to other currencies, but the dollar as the linchpin of the world financial system is here for quite a lot longer.